Hello again, and welcome to section 2 of the interest groups lecture. So let's just, as a quick reminder, remember that interest groups are an organized group of individuals sharing common objectives who actively attempt to influence policymakers in all three branches of government and at all levels of government. We spent most of the last video talking about how this definition plays out and then how interest groups are formed, including their roles and how they fit into the larger fabric of American politics. Let me apologize that my computer seems to be wheezing, so if you hear a weird background white noise, that's what's going on. So hopefully that will solve itself soon. Where we want to go today is we want to talk more about sort of not really the formation, but why people join. So if you remember from our earlier video, we talked about that there are interest groups that individual citizens can join, and then ones that only businesses or professional designations can join. So let's talk about why individuals join interest groups in general. So here I'm talking about interest groups like the Sierra Club, like the AARP, like the National Rifle Association, like Common Cause, and other groups like that. So why do people join? Well, some of this is just fairly obvious, right? They join for power in order to aggregate their opinions and their voices together in order to make an impact on the world around them. But the reality is that there are plenty of people who want this kind of power and don't actually join an interest group. And so some of what's happening in this sense then, or in this case then, is that people join both based on their feelings of efficacy and also in order to increase their efficacy. Now, normally this is the point at which I would ask all of you in class, do you guys know what efficacy is? But since I don't have you in front of me, let me tell you, efficacy is the feeling like you can do something or feel like you can accomplish something. So it's less of an idea whether you can actually do it or not, and it's more about the feeling or the intention to do so. So when you talk about people who have political efficacy, they are people who feel like they can make a difference in politics. And that's what's going on when people join interest groups. Now, we would normally think, okay, well, that makes sense. People join interest groups to gain power because they feel like they want to make a difference. But the reality that we know is that it's slightly different than this. So there's a bunch of sort of classic political science and economics research on why people join groups. And one of the things that we know is that people join groups to gain benefits, really, because otherwise, why would you join a group, right? There's all these kinds of questions about things like rational actors doing collective action. Why would you join when you could just free ride and get the benefits of the political change without having joined? Well, what groups offer are a series of benefits to convince people to join. Now, the first kind of benefit is obvious. These are material benefits. And these can range everything from the insurance that you get when you join AARP, or you can think of this as coupons, right? That's what we think of when I talk about material benefits. You get some sort of thing for joining. Sometimes it's like a tote bag. Sometimes it's even just like information. So you get newsletters. And then there are other things that fit into this. Professional organizations offer material benefits in the sense that you get access to things like meetings or to new business partners or things like that. So a lot of that is going on. So there's lots of people who join AAA, the American Automobile Association, for their roadside assistance benefits. But what they don't realize is they're actually joining an interest group as well, who lobbies in Congress about things like the speed limit and traffic rules and stuff like that. So those are material benefits. Then there are the purposive benefits, right? The things that you would expect. People join interest groups in order to change policy. So they join for a purpose. But here's the thing. Neither of those types of benefits hold a candle to our third type of benefit, which actually seems to make the biggest difference for why people join interest groups. And that is what we call the solidarity benefit. Now, that's sort of a fancy word for the feeling of being part of something bigger than yourself. So the feeling that you are part of a group. I mean, the other way to think about this is as identity, right? So think about all of the stickers that you have on your laptops, right? You can think about these in terms of like bumper stickers on cars too, or things like that. But almost everybody, including me, has stickers on their laptops. And what do those stickers signify? Well, they're telling the world about who you are. Well, guess what? In some cases, telling the world about who you are also means having certain memberships in certain kinds of organizations. So before the legalization across the country of same-sex marriage and the Obergefell decision, lots of people had bumper stickers on their cars, which were these blue squares with yellow equal signs in it. And that's all that it was. There was nothing about where it was from. It was just this equal sign. And people knew, well, that's a marriage equality sticker. And so people put those things on their cars and on their laptops, right, to say, yeah, I support marriage equality. But here's the thing. What we know about the solidarity benefit is it's not just saying I support marriage equality. What it's saying is I am the kind of person who supports marriage equality, right? So it's an identity piece too, right? So that's why solidarity benefits are so important, because what they're doing is that they are both demonstrating to the world to say, I am part of this group, but also you're saying to yourself, I am this kind of person. So that's a really important piece of understanding how and particularly why people join groups. So who joins then? Who are the people who are looking for these kinds of benefits? Well, we know, well, except that I just spelled higher education wrong. Sorry. We know that it's linked to the same kinds of things we talked about in terms of participation with voting, right? So higher levels of education, higher levels of income, people who have who are politically sophisticated, right? Who are interested in politics and have information about it. But the bottom line is this: being active in an organization, doing participation beyond voting, and even to some degree beyond just writing a paycheck, requires something of you. Maybe not like time to go to a protest, but just it requires thought and to follow through on a series of processes in order to join an organization, to respond to that email, to write that check, to put that sticker on your car or your laptop. So in that sense, it's no different than anything else that we've talked about in terms of political participation. Now, I think the best way to think about this is to talk about the kinds of groups that people join as private interests versus public interests. Now, when I started teaching this class many years ago now, I talked about these as citizen interest groups and business interest groups. But I actually think that these sort of larger ideas of private and public interest actually give us a better picture of what interest groups actually look like. So when we're talking about private interests, yes, we're talking about business groups and labor. So business groups are groups that you cannot join if you're just an individual citizen. You have to be a company. You have to be that kind of organization. Labor groups also qualify because the benefits that they are looking for are narrowed to their particular constituency, right? That's another way to think about a private interest. And private interest is a group that's looking to benefit a narrowed or specific group of people, organizations, or businesses. On the other hand, public interest groups are designed to or are intending to gain some benefit that applies to everybody, right? So if we talk about private interest, we can also even maybe think about like taxpayer groups, right? Or things like that, which is a group that an individual can join. So it is in fact a citizen interest group, but it's gained or it's geared toward a narrowed group of people getting the benefits. So public interest groups often are things like civil rights groups. They are intended to gain liberties or rights for people, whether they are part of that narrow group or not. So these are things like the ACLU, Second Amendment groups like the NRA fall under this kind of organization. You can also think of things like age, so categories of individuals, race and ethnicity groups, so things like the NAACP, or groups that are focused on particular ethnic groups in the United States, like Jews or Arabs or Muslims. Those are all racial and ethnic groups that have organizations, and even gender, so things like the National Organization for Women. Now, there are also what we think of as grassroots interest groups that are part of this public interest, public interest section, right? So these are things like consumer groups, environmental groups, right? So environmental groups count as public interest, right? Because they're trying to gain benefits to the environment, not just for their group, but for everyone in society. Good government groups fall under this, but so do social issue groups, things like the MAD, so Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or the Humane Society, American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And then things like some international issues, right? So these are things that are created by primarily citizen groups who are, citizen members who are interested in creating benefits for society at large that aren't necessarily linked to things like civil rights. So what makes an interest group powerful? Well, these kind of things in some ways are linked to how they're formed, right? So their size makes them powerful, or it can be the size of the constituency, right? Or the amount of GDP and the gross domestic product that they represent. So large citizen groups like the AARP have power, but so do big groups like the National Petroleum Producers Association, not because there are so many of them who belong to that group, but because they represent such a huge part of the American economy. Resources make interest groups powerful. Now, yes, issues, but it's also people, right? Remember the conversation about how groups require resources in order to form. It's also about the issues that they're working on, right? It's easier to get people to join or give money or businesses to donate if you're working on an issue that is visible and important to lots of different people. Then leadership, right? Interest groups have influence if they have strong leadership. Some of the most powerful people heading up interest groups or particularly professional organizations are former members of the executive branch. The former chief of staff to President Johnson, to LBJ, that later on became the director of the National Recording Association, so the entire music industry, right? So that's the kind of leadership that makes interest groups powerful. And then cohesiveness, right? Infighting among interest groups is classic, right? That's why different kinds of interest groups end up falling apart, right? Is that they have to keep their constituency all on the same page, or at least well represent the issues that are important to their constituency. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears, like I talked about earlier, to talk more about the representation of interest. So we're going to talk about what it means to do lobbying and to do the kinds of interest groups actions that we're expecting. Now, the first way that interest groups, the kind of activities that they can do we split this into two sections: indirect action and direct action. Remember, so what are interest groups trying to do? Remember, they're trying to impact public policy. And so all of those things that we've talked about for the last couple of minutes are about gaining constituency and resources and just the ability to do the things they need to do to change policy. So there's a lot of different strategies they can choose. The first is what we think of as public pressure. So this is an indirect action because this is not asking a member of Congress, for example, directly to change policy. It's by trying to get the public to ask for that change, or a member's constituents to ask for that change. Some of this is about like media noise, right? So this is when you get emails from interest groups asking you to send a letter, send an email, make a phone call to your member of Congress or to a particular committee or to a part of the executive branch. And some of this is when they release press releases, right? They're doing things to get themselves media coverage. And what they're trying to do is to activate constituents, to get the people who are interested in the issues that they care about to also put pressure on decision makers, right? Because you're not talking to decision makers directly, you're going through citizens. Indirect action is also just the sort of maintenance stuff that interest groups do, the education and mobilization functions that are at work. Remember, we talked about those in the interest group roles. And finally, public protest operates in terms of indirect action. Now, I think of public protest in sort of two ways. One is the positive way, which are sort of like the rallies. Many interest groups do this, particularly at the state level. They'll have a rally on the State House steps, and somebody will talk, and then all the people who are there at the rally will go in and try to talk to their members of the state legislature. But then there are also sort of what I think of as on the negative side, like actual sort of protests. So marches on Washington and other kinds of more or less, not violent, but intense, let's say, meetings of people together to create protest. So then there's direct action. The other strategy that interest groups can use is actually, so it's personal contact, right? It's talking directly to the decision maker. One way is what we think of as scorecards. I know that's kind of weird because in theory those are supposed to be about like people voting. But what that's actually doing is communicating to a decision maker, particularly a member of Congress or a state legislator, we agree with the decisions that you're making or we don't. Direct action also includes strategic alliances with other groups, right? Many times the most successful campaigns to lobby Congress about a particular issue come about by the creation or the mixing of resources of a number of different groups. Direct action in terms of personal contact, casual meetings in social spaces. I don't know how many of you guys have ever been to Washington, D.C. and have sort of walked around down there around where the congressional office buildings are. But you see all the time, like a member of Congress or particularly a member of the Senate who's like walking around outside with their posse, right? All their little staffers with their phones. And you'll see lobbyists sort of bump into them on the sidewalk and say, oh, hey, Senator, we met at this thing. And they do that kind of stuff in order to sort of talk to them and remind them and to get them to pay attention, to bring the kinds of issues that they care about to the front of their head. But really here, that's when we start moving toward lobbying, right? So we think of lobbying as like just like sitting in the room in a member's office asking them to do something, but there's all sorts of aspects to this, right? One of the biggest pieces of lobbying itself, the actual sort of convincing and persuasion, is that the people who have the most impact on decision makers' ways of thinking are people who have been in those positions. So the most effective lobbyists for members of Congress are former members of Congress. That's why there are rules about when they can do it. The most effective lobbyist for someone who works in the Environmental Protection Agency is someone else who has previously worked in the Environmental Protection Agency. Why? Well, some of it's about network and personal connection. But the bigger issue is about understanding the constraints under which that decision maker operates, right? So if I used to work at the EPA, then I have a better handle on what you as a current EPA employee, what the kinds of constraints that you are operating under, who's in charge and what kind of problems there are, right? So that's why that kind of lobbying is so effective. And that is called the revolving door, right? That's kind of the idea where people who sort of move up in an agency or move up in Congress and even staffing, we'll talk about that when we get to Congress, who switch sides, who go over to K Street, right? Because that's where all the lobbyists have their offices, on K Street in Washington, D.C. And that's the idea. Those people are more effective at lobbying. So they have these private meetings, right, between the lobbyist and a member of Congress or some other official. Sometimes it's just wherever they meet. Sometimes there's actual appointments, right? You need to register in order to lobby in Congress, for example. But that doesn't mean that you are only meeting with them in their offices. There are lots of other kinds of social spaces where that happens. The other thing that's actually lobbying is testimony in front of congressional committees, right? Remember again, the flow of information, the need of members of Congress and other people in government to better understand specific policies. Well, who gets to do that? In a lot of cases, it's people who have expertise. And sometimes, frequently, that's lobbyists. Now, the thing is that you will hear members of Congress in particular, but even some state legislators say things like, oh, well, you know, I write my own bills. That's not true. Members of Congress, to some degree, and state legislators to a huge degree, rely on lobbyists and interest groups to write their bills. Just as an aside, think about what's going on when a state legislator who's only allowed to meet for 90 days a year and who gets paid $30,000 to do that, who has to have another job in order to continue to support themselves, and whose state has decided not to fund what's called the Legislative Services Bureau. It means that they have no time or ability to write their own bills. Well, guess what? That's what lobbyists and interest groups end up doing. And so that is a way of lobbying. Why? Because it's a huge help to those members of the legislature, but it's also instituting your particular version of what you want to have happen. It's all about information. That's the bottom line over and over again. When I teach the course on interest groups and lobbying, this is what we talk about over and over and over again, is the importance of information and trust and the ability for lobbyists to give good information. So it's absolutely possible, and it happens, to lobby the president, to lobby the executive branch, to lobby those agencies, the presidential staff, all the people in the West Wing that we'll learn about after the next exam. Those people are lobbied all the time. But see, the thing that happens as well is that Congress is obviously lobbied. They're sort of our primary example. But even the courts are lobbied. And we'll talk more about this when we get to the judicial section. But basically what can happen is that a lobbyist can't, like, talk directly to a judge, right? Like, that's against the principles of the system. But there is a kind of legal or lawyerly lobbying called amicus curiae briefs. And that's a Latin term that means friend of the court. And basically what's going on is interest groups and their lawyers are writing legal briefs trying to lay out a set of arguments about why the court ought to decide one way or the other. And they end up being really important in Supreme Court cases. But that's the one way you can lobby the judicial system. But what that means is that all the branches of government can be lobbied. All right, we're done for this section of the course. When we come back for the next video, we will talk about money and interest groups.